Welcome back. Please take your seats as soon as possible. Thank you. So welcome back. I hope that you could enjoy your lunch and that you're very ready for the two exciting sessions that we have ahead of us. For this second session, we will be discussing how we can strengthen property taxes, which have been mentioned to be one of the main taxes for local revenue. And we will be discussing about property taxes and how to enhance subnational government revenue. The roundtable will be moderated by Mr. Damien Servan from GIZ. But first, however, to provide some initial insights, I am pleased to invite to the podium Margot Vincent, Policy Analyst at the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities at the OECD. Margot, the floor is yours.
Dear guests, chers invités, it is my pleasure to introduce the second roundtable on how to strengthen property tax to enhance subnational government revenue. So before diving into the property tax, I would like first to present a snapshot of subnational tax revenue across the world. The graph here represents the share of subnational tax revenue in public tax revenue and in GDP in 2020. On average, tax revenue accounts for 15% of public tax revenue, 2.9% of GDP, and almost a third of subnational government revenue. So we can see that taxation, which comprises own source and shared taxes, is a major source for subnational governments, but the second after grants and subsidies. We can also see wide disparities between countries and especially between federal countries that typically allocate more taxing power to subnational governments and unitary country in the bottom left corner of the graph. So among subnational tax revenue, the recurrent property tax is a key local source of revenue. In 2020, it represented an average of 1/3 of subnational tax revenue for 87 countries, and more than 50% in 19 countries. But it represented less than 1% of GDP on average, reflecting that the tax remains still underexploited at the national level. Beyond this average, there are also strong disparities among countries. In some Anglo-Saxon countries, such as Canada or the US, the property tax is often the main source of tax revenue for local governments, but it does generate strong revenue and represents more than 1.5% of GDP. By contrast, in some other countries, the revenue generated from property tax represents less than 0.5% of GDP, such as in Eastern European countries, underlining that the property tax remains underexploited. And when looking at property tax, it's important to note that it's not always a pure own source tax, on which local governments have a power on the rate or the base, but in some countries, property tax can be strongly regulated by the central government, and in some cases, subnational governments do not have any power over the base or the rates. So here, the graph on the left represents the share of property tax in subnational tax revenue, and the graph on the right in GDP in 2020. We can see that property tax represents a high share of subnational tax revenue in Latin American countries and in African countries, while it represents a low share of GDP for these countries. And when we look at the income groups, property tax represents a very low share of GDP for low and for lower middle groups, while it does represent a large share for high-income countries. So this clearly underlines the need for developing countries to reform their property tax systems. As shown during the presentation this morning, the COVID crisis has put a large pressure on subnational tax revenue, which decreased in many countries in 2020, as for the property tax. Between 2019 and 2020, the property tax decreased by around 6%, with wide disparities among countries. The tax has remained stable in most countries, and it has decreased in several countries. So how we can explain this? Exemptions that have been implemented for some category of taxpayers during the pandemic, tax deferrals, but also increased delinquencies. And in terms of property tax design, the most effective property taxes have been the one based on property market value and business property tax as a result of business bankruptcies. But despite this, the property tax has been less affected than other taxes, such as those relying on economic activities, on employment or consumption, because it is a less volatile source of revenue. And it seems that, again, it has reported a good growth in 2021. So we often praise the property tax as the key local tax with key benefits, but it also generates several challenges to be fully effective. So I won't present all the different advantages and challenges, since most of them will be discussed during the roundtable, but I will underline 3 key challenges that are especially relevant in developing countries. The first is to keep pace with the wealth that property constitutes when calculating the value of the tax base. So it's either based on the area or the rental or market value of the property. The second is the lack of reliable cadastre system, which is a key obstacle to the efficient collection of the tax. And the third that I would like to mention is tax user capacity, which can be a strong obstacle in developing countries. So despite the obstacle we mentioned, property tax reform has become widespread over the last decade. And we could saw this in all regions of the world. They have also increased in developing countries and in the least developed countries, while these countries face additional obstacles: rapid urbanization, wide income disparities, a lack of cooperation between governments to share data, a lack of reliable cadastre system, and a lack of data standardization, among others. So in order to provide a full picture across the world, we have compiled the main property tax reforms over the past 5 years in this new edition of the Observatory, which also reflects a wide diversity of reforms across the world. In Africa, for instance, reforms aim to improve the cadastre system, such as in Sierra Leone, and to modernize technical systems for tax collection, such as in Ghana or Nigeria. In many countries, the reforms aim to improve property valuation and to update it more regularly. New property tax were also promoted in Thailand, in 2 pilot cities in China, and a modification of the tax rates and the implementation of a surtax for certain property were also implemented in some countries. And I will now conclude this presentation and hand the floor to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margot, for your clear and interesting presentation to set the scene. Now I'm pleased to crack on with the second roundtable. I'm pleased to give the floor to Mr. Damian Sarvan for the moderation of this roundtable. Damian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Margot, for giving us a really interesting analytical overview of the current data on property taxation. It shows that there's still a high disparity and that property taxation is still an unexploited revenue. You mentioned the key challenges. I think it's not only always a technical challenge, but also when it comes to political, economical dimension and the normative dimension, you need to see it more holistically when you want to have successful property taxation reforms. And this will be the discussion for today. Before I invite the speakers one by one and introduce them, I just wanted to set the logistical frame here. So we will have 2 rounds of questions, and then if time will be there, we will have a rapid one. And afterwards, I would like to invite the audience to actually ask their own questions. So with no further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Sarah Parrott to the stage. She's the head of the Personal and Property Taxes Unit from the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD. Welcome. Mr. Dario Runtic, he's a government affairs and public policy expert from the Association of Cities of the Republic of Croatia. Welcome. Mr. Huáscar Egino, a quite known property tax specialist. He's a lead fiscal management specialist from the Inter-American Development Bank. Virtually, I would like to welcome Mr. Nino Raymond Alvina. He's the executive director of the Bureau of Local Government Finance of Department of Finance from the Philippines. See here? Welcome. And last but not least, Mr. Graham Stewart Wilson, technical lead for diagnostic assessments from the Local Government Revenue Initiative. This initiative expands the work of the African Property Tax Initiative, and he's from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Okay. So if you're all set, for each question you will have around 5 minutes, and if I show you like the white card, then you might have another minute left. So, and Ms. Parrott, if you allow me, I would like to announce the first question to you. This round of questions will be about the obstacles of property tax reforms mainly. Ms. Parrott, property taxes remain a limited source of total tax revenue across OECD countries, and their share has remained relatively constant within the overall tax composition over the last decade, while the property value has increased. How do you explain this?
Hello, everyone. And first of all, let me thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. So just as background, we released in the summer a big report on housing taxation in OECD countries. So in that report, we cover all of the taxes that are levied on housing. So obviously the property tax, but also the taxation of rental income, capital gains taxes on sales of properties, stamp duties, inheritance and gift taxes that apply to housing. So really the full spectrum of taxes that are levied on housing. And so if you're interested, you can have a look at that report. But among all of those taxes on housing, the property tax is, first of all, the most common tax levied on housing in the OECD. But it's also one of the taxes that have consistently been found to be among the least distortive or most efficient types of taxes. And that's due to a number of factors, and there were quite a few on the slide, but mainly because of the immobility of the tax base and the more limited behavioral responses of taxpayers to property taxes compared to other taxes. So I'm very happy to be talking about property taxes with you today. So just to add to some of the numbers that were given, because numbers are always helpful, and you are at the OECD after all, so more numbers is always a good thing. Despite the fact that property taxes have all these good efficiency properties, they're actually a very small source of revenue in the OECD countries. So to give you an idea, they represent only about 3% of total tax revenues in OECD countries. So obviously 3% is very low, and it's much lower than taxes like VAT or personal income taxes or social security contributions, which each represent between 1/4 and 1/5 of total tax revenues in OECD countries. So very low revenues from property taxes. What might seem even more surprising is what was raised in the question, which is if we look at the evolution of property tax revenues in recent decades, we haven't actually seen a very strong growth in property tax revenues, despite the fact that there's been a very strong growth in property values. And so this is something that we look at in our report. We basically document the very strong increase in property values in OECD countries in the last 3 decades. And by the way, property values also saw an acceleration in their growth during the pandemic. And we compare that to a much more subdued growth in property tax revenues. And so there are different reasons that explain why property tax revenues have not been keeping up with the growth in house values. The main one being that many OECD countries still rely on very outdated values for the purposes of their property taxes. And so I'll give you a few examples. I'll give you first France. France relies on values from 1970 for its property tax. Austria from 1973, Belgium from 1975, and the UK from 1991, and there are many other countries. So some of these countries will index for inflation or will have some corrective factor, but obviously it's not the same as updating property values. And relying on outdated property values is not just a problem from a revenue perspective, it's also a problem from a fairness perspective. Why? Because it means that households with valuable housing today, because the value of their housing has gone up tremendously, are not necessarily taxed more than other households. So it's not just a revenue question, it's a fairness question. Of course, and this is what we discussed at lunch, actually, I think there is agreement that relying on outdated property values for the property tax is something that needs to be changed, but those are extremely difficult political reforms because obviously there are many losers of these types of reforms because it means that potentially people are going to be facing much higher property taxes, especially in countries that haven't done any value updates for decades. But the good news is that there's some countries that have successfully updated their property values, like Denmark, like Ireland, like Norway. And the way they do that is they generally have a sort of big bang property tax reform where they update the values, but they also lower the tax rates to make sure that it doesn't, the value update doesn't translate into exponential growth in property tax liabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very interesting that one of the main challenges that the OECD has still outdated value data. I think another example would be Germany, but they're still in reforms currently and trying to update this data. Coming to a more country-specific question to Mr. Dario Runtic. What benefits do you see arising from the use of property taxes for subnational government finances in Croatia and in the NALAS region? In reverse, what are the 2 or 3 most important obstacles to the establishment and proper functioning of a property tax system?
Thank you, Damian. Just like Sarah said, property taxes in NALAS region, which is Southeast Europe region, are also rather small share of overall tax burden that is being imposed. But when it comes down to the local governments, property taxation in Southeast Europe region make up about 30% of own source revenues for local governments, which is rather significant source of revenues for local governments. The intergovernmental system we have in place pretty much relies on grants and transfers from central government level for decentralized functions. And these can change at the whim of a central government, whether political whim or in case of situations like we recently had, the pandemic stroke, and the governments had to react, and sometimes the grants and transfers were cut back or intervened with. In Croatia, we recently had a major earthquake, which again impacted grants and transfers. So it's really the property taxation that is being looked up upon in local governments in the region as a stable source of revenue since the tax base can't really leave, unlike many of our citizens who, by joining the European Union, it was much easier for them to leave and pretty much erode the tax base versus the real estate, which cannot leave. So we see it as an important source of stability, the revenue predictability, which is one of the issues in the region, which we've detected with subnational PFA assignments. We also see it as a leverage to take on more decentralized responsibilities. Right now, the systems are in place that allow local government to take up new opportunities, new functions, if they have secured the funding for it. But there aren't that many sources of funding that could secure such a level of funding for functions. And I'm rather disappointed to hear that the registers are outdated, because we've been really hoping to capture the growth of property value in the region, which is also significant, and perhaps gain some more resources by simply capturing the increase in the value of the property. But it seems that we'll have to work hard on that. One of the issues, the important issues, is the relationship with central government registries, the property registries and taxpayer registries. And the practice has shown that in countries which have established good intergovernmental relationship, there is a good increase in collection and better maintained local registers, unlike in the other countries.
Thank you, Dario. Then I would like to go to the next question to Mr. Egino. As I already mentioned, as an expert on property taxation in Latin America, could you please describe the situation of property taxation at the subnational level in Latin American and Caribbean countries? Do property taxes present important opportunities in Latin American countries, and are they well exploited by local governments? And what are the main obstacles?
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. It's nice to be here and to share with you some ideas about what's happening with this tax in Latin America. You made a huge effort in presenting this new report. IDB also has a report that incorporates 17,000 municipalities of Latin America. So we have a very good understanding of what's going on with property taxes in Latin America. We have, as I said, 17,000 local governments, and we are only collecting 0.4%, 0.5% of GDP as property taxes. This is less than half of what OECD countries are collecting. So here we have a really huge, a very important challenge. Although I would say that we have a very big heterogeneity. We have countries that are collecting very well property taxes, like Brazil, Colombia, or other countries like Chile and Uruguay. So basically, we have a very big diversity of cases. It's very important, though, to concentrate on the countries that are collecting more taxes and to try to find out what are the reasons on why these countries are collecting more taxes than others. In the case of Uruguay and Chile, it's very interesting to find out that the technical capabilities, the technical capacities are well concentrated. So most of the property tax is explained by the cities of Santiago de Chile and Montevideo. So the reason in these two countries is that the technical capacities are high, and they are concentrated. The other cases are also very interesting. The case of Colombia, for example. Cadastres are centralized for small cities and are decentralized for bigger cities. So we have the case of Bogota, Medellin, Cali, other cities that are managing their own cadastres, and these are cities with a very high capacity. So basically, here we're talking about a model that's combining decentralization and centralization of cadastre. It's a very unusual institutional setting, but it's working because in Colombia, as I said, the bigger cities are explaining most of property taxes. Same situation with Brazil. In Brazil, it's, as you know, a very decentralized country with a very strong urban setting, cities with good capabilities, and most of them are collecting taxes very well. That's the situation in general for Latin America. Of course, the benefits of having these taxes are very, very important, very huge. What we found is that when you collect your own taxes, the relation between taxes and benefits is higher. So basically what you do is that you collect taxes, but at the same time people, the citizens, demand from the government to allocate these resources to their local needs. So when you have a bigger local tax, when you have a bigger property tax, the relation of this tax with local benefits is higher, therefore you are increasing local efficiency. So it's important to understand that once that you have bigger fiscal autonomy, once that you have bigger property taxes, the relation between of these taxes with local benefits is higher, and that's something that's one of the main benefits of this tax. And we also concentrate to something that we think is very important. What's the capacity of this tax to help us leverage some of the resources? As you know, US, for example, most of local infrastructure in the US is based on property tax. They have municipal bonds, that are based on this source of payment, property taxes, and we should move in that direction. We're trying to help countries and cities in Latin America to move in that direction. So if they have more autonomy, if they collect more taxes, they can build the basis to access the capital markets and be able to finance their own infrastructure. And one more minute, and I won't talk about the obstacles. Probably we can do it in the next round. Thank you.
We can take that up. Oh, you have 1 minute left. I mean, if you...
Oh. I can go back.
Yeah, we can still talk about the obstacles.
Obstacles. I'm going to be brief then about the obstacles. You have. I won't repeat what they already said, because one obstacle, big obstacle, institutional capacity. Of course, the problem of assessments. They're lagging behind what's going on in the market. Of course, we have problems of cadastres, but I would try to concentrate more in other obstacles. First of all, political obstacle. This is a tax that people really, the politicians don't like because it's very visible. We also have, the relation between taxpayers and local governments. That's another obstacle. Sometimes you don't provide transparency. People don't know what you are doing with your taxes. It's very common to talk with citizens. They will say, I won't pay taxes because this politician is going to take all this money and spend it, we don't know where. So it's very important. One obstacle is the relation between local citizens and local governments. And of course, in Latin America, one obstacle is informality, as someone said this morning. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping the time. I'm the terrible person who has to keep the time here in order. But thank you for pointing out the obstacles and showing that they're probably not only these obstacles in Latin American, Caribbean countries relevant, but also in other regions. And Margot, you also pointed out that the technical capacities are one of the key challenges. And you actually followed up on my holistical approach, on a political, economic, and normative approach. The next question I would like to direct to Ms. Salvina, and thank you once again for joining. I'm sitting here on the bottom, but I have to read somehow and be close to the microphone, so please excuse me. What were the main motivations for initiating property tax reform in the Philippines? What did this reform consist of and how it was implemented? And the last question, what are the main points of improvement that you have addressed?
Thank you, Damian. And first of all, let me thank the OECD for the invitation. Good morning from Syracuse. Good afternoon to all my colleagues and to the participants to this conference. Let me respond to the question on the motivations. Well, the property tax reform in the Philippines is actually part of a long-term agenda to improve the land administration and management sector, starting in early 2000 under the Land Administration and Management Project, or the LAMP Phase 1. At that time, we were supported by World Bank, Australian Aid, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and we faced and discovered many challenging realities in the sector. In the mid-2000s, we investigated more, and solutions were tested under a whole of government approach, looking at policies, systems, institutions, and capacity building. And that was in phase 2 of the project. In 2010, the Department of Finance adopted a roadmap for property valuation and taxation reforms, and my office, the Bureau of Local Government Finance, together with partner agencies and local governments, used property taxation and valuation tools as a way of promoting good local fiscal governance. And more recently, in 2018, the Philippine government, with support from the Asian Development Bank, or the ADB, as our development partner, designed the Local Governance Reform Program, or what we call the LGRP, as a major project and investment for the local governments, building on the previous projects that we have completed. Now, there are several motivations for this strategy, but let me highlight 3 compelling reasons. First, the resources needed by our local governments must grow to fund the increasing spending requirements for the services, the devolved services that they provide. As mentioned by Sarah earlier, property tax actually offers a very sustainable and progressive source of revenues for this purpose, without depending heavily on external sources. And the program we have seeks to broaden the tax base for property-related taxes. And therefore, we want to improve tax collections without necessarily increasing the existing tax rates or creating or devising new taxes or new tax impositions for the LGU. I want to underscore this progressivity aspect, because this is an essential dimension in good property taxation. Ideally, as what Sarah mentioned, the property values used for taxation should reflect or approximate the real property's market value. And she noted the acceleration of increase in property values even during the pandemic. And like what Mr. Eguina mentioned, in Latin American countries, our property tax in the Philippines is also below par, only, I think, less than 0.4% or 0.4% of the GDP in the last 10 years. Now, the second motivation is from a fiscal decentralization point of view, because our constitution, the Philippine Constitution, and our existing laws enacted by Congress actually grant our local governments the power and authority to use property taxation for their benefit. But we have seen declining trends in several areas. For example, in terms of compliance in updating the property values, only 8 to 10% of the local governments were regularly updating their values in the mid to late 2000s, even if the law requires that they should revise every 3 years. Collection efficiency is also below par. Less than 60% of what is due and demandable are collected in aggregate levels. And we want to turn this around through policy and legislative proposals and capacity building for local governments. The third and final point that I want to mention is that we want to build greater trust and confidence in the property valuation, especially by the government, and making it simpler, fairer, and more efficient, using the right tools and technologies to ensure uniformity, consistency, with the standards and international best practices. When we did some baseline work, we noted multiple agencies in our country performing or requiring valuation work for different purposes. Let me just cite an example. For instance, there are 2 bases being used for taxation purposes. One is for national and the other is for local. And we want to harmonize this process and the methods to conform with the standards, make it more efficient, with regularity in the revaluation process, guided by the central government and updated. And transparency is also an element and vital in building the trust that I have just mentioned to ensure that property tax administration is contributing to or enabling a vibrant land market. And we want to enhance the reliability and the quality of property appraisal to address the sector efficiency. So if I still have time, I think I just
I don't know.
like to point out.
I showed the card.
Oh, I'm
You
sorry.
just have a couple of seconds left. I don't know if you've seen it, but yeah, please, if you could conclude.
Let me just conclude that the reform agenda that we adopted is quite comprehensive, focusing on 5 reform areas. One is through legislation to modify and amend the legal framework. Second is we adopted valuation standards in line with the internationally prescribed standards and updated the manuals. Third is we engage local governments by pilot work and mainstreaming the reforms and proving that the property tax will really benefit them. Fourth is the use of technology for database development and digitalization. And lastly, capacity building. So the whole strategy that we have adopted requires consistency, continuity in institutional leadership and commitment, and active engagements and collaboration with different partners and stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting, and thank you for pointing out how important good local fiscal governance is, and thank you for the explanation how important legislation, the technology is to build up the capacity so that you have a successful property tax reform. I would like to finish the first round of questions with Graham. So Graham, the Local Government Revenue Initiative was founded to do research about how to build better property tax systems and then to work with governments to translate those research ideas into practice. Central to that program has been research into simplified approaches to property valuation. While you then supported a very successful reform program in Freetown based on those ideas, can you explain the simplified approach to valuation and what you think made it so successful?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Damien, and very happy to be here and share ideas with all of you. So in terms of the reform that we supported in Freetown and the simplified approach to property assessment, one of the central goals was to try to increase the overall equity of the property tax system. As we've heard, fairness is a big issue when it comes to property valuations. And what we observed under the previous system of property assessment in Freetown was really a huge amount of inequity. So, to give you a concrete example, there were many cases of, for example, a small tin shack that might be assessed at the same level as a much higher quality masonry home. And in our experience, this kind of inequity really undermines effective property taxation in 3 main ways. So first is just, inequity places a heavy burden on the poorest residents of the city. But second, high levels of inequity also undermine overall revenue collection or the revenue potential of the property tax system as a whole. In theory, the majority of property tax revenue should be coming from the highest value properties, and if those are undervalued or underassessed, which is the main driver of inequity, then it's going to undermine the overall revenue potential of the system. And then third, as we've heard from some of the other speakers, inequity also contributes to a broader lack of trust in the property tax system, which limits the extent of political support for any kind of reform initiative that's going to try to increase tax collection. So in other words, without a more equitable distribution of the property tax burden, it becomes really difficult to imagine the political feasibility of really any kind of reform effort that has to do with property taxation. So the simplified approach to assessment that was adopted by Freetown was then an important tool to help address that kind of inequality that I've talked about. So the basic idea here was to identify and measure all properties within Freetown's jurisdiction using satellite imagery coupled with ground truthing by teams of enumerators who went door to door to each property. Those teams of enumerators also collected information on some key building characteristics, so for example, the type and quality of walls and roofs. And then what we did was develop a very simple model calibrated to a sample of rental values from Freetown that would use these measurements and building features to basically generate estimated values for each of the properties in the system. So this simplified approach to property assessment resulted in a five-fold increase in the overall revenue potential of Freetown's property tax system. But really crucially, this five-fold increase was driven mainly by large increases in value to the most valuable properties, and actually decreases or no change for the lowest value properties or average properties. In some places, administrators talk about the 80-20 rule, so the idea that 80% of revenue should come from 20% of properties. And the simplified approach to assessment that was introduced in Freetown essentially achieves that goal. So this kind of simplified approach can be an important part of efforts to create more equitable property tax systems, but it's also unlikely to be successful just on its own. So for example, the Freetown reform was much broader than simply adopting this one technical feature, this simplified approach to assessment. It also included efforts to increase overall transparency of the tax system, so that, for example, taxpayers could easily understand how their bills had been calculated, as well as providing them with information on what their neighbors were being asked to pay or what other similar properties were being asked to pay, so they had a basis on which to judge the overall fairness of the tax system. It also included efforts to make the payment system much more convenient and easy for taxpayers, as well as the appeals process. So overall, this kind of I guess the last thing I should mention too is that on top of these sort of broader components of the reform, it was also situated within the mayor's Transform Freetown agenda. So this was a policy agenda that included a number of different initiatives, including a heavy focus on improved service delivery. And the simplified approach to assessment was situated within that broader reform. And we really think that its inclusion in the broader Transform Freetown agenda helped with building the necessary public support for this kind of reform and the kind of political coalitions that are necessary to make this kind of reform successful. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for explaining the simplified valuation approach, which shows that there are also that there are approaches which are not so cost-intensive, but really valuable and can have a high impact. Now I would like to move to the second discussion round, which will be more about recommendations to reform property taxation and criteria for successful reforms. And Nino, I would like to directly start with you. What have been the main difficulties in the implementation of the property tax reforms in the Philippines? And can you already highlight some positive results? And what would be, in your opinion, be the next steps?
Thank you, Damian. Let me first respond to the specific question, then I will share some recommendations and conclusions in response to the general question. So, in the case of the Philippines, I'd like to cite some examples that where we encountered difficulties or challenges that we meet along the way or continue to face in implementing the reforms. At the local level, the common misconception is that when revaluation is made or when the assessor proposes an updating of the schedule of market values to the local chief executive and to the local council, the increase in resulting taxes would be the same. Well, in a very simplistic way of saying it, the notion is that if the values go up by 100%, then the taxes paid from last year would automatically be just as high. But that's not the absolute case because there are tools at the disposal of the local governments. They can adjust both the tax rates and the assessment levels without distorting the market value of the property. And taking into consideration the ability of taxpayers to pay for the funding requirement of the local government. And this is a challenge because of the observed practice that the technical aspect of valuation or revaluation is often commingled with the political functions of setting the assessment level and the tax rate. And this is the difficulty when political capital is necessary to effect an upward adjustment in the values. Often the counterbalancing measures allowed by law, the levers that they can use, are actually not being enforced. So the usual recourse is for local governments to continuously defer the revaluation over a long period or prolonged period of time, often taking more than a decade to change because of that notion. As valuations are approved at the local level, it's hard to effect a regular revaluation. However, we have seen a significant change in the outlook based on the long-term strategy in our reform program, change in the outlook of many local governments as we continue to do advocacy and capacity building, and we regularly do compliance review of the local governments. To illustrate, in 2010, only 6% of our local governments were revising the property values. In 2015, it reached 27%, and in 2020, the compliance of local government reached 46%. And this means more and more local governments and officials recognize the need to revalue and improve their property tax administration. And this improvement is also supported by continuously updating the standards and guidelines that we provide to our assessors. Additional example is on standards. When we first adopted the Philippine Valuation Standards in 2009, we have updated it already, and we are now using the 2018 standards in accordance with the International Valuation Standards Council, of which the Bureau of Local Government Finance is an institutional member. And we have also consistently provided trainings for local assessors every year, and our regional offices of the BLGF have been instrumental in achieving this and managing the scale of the trainings needed. Our partnership with the academe through the University of the Philippines, Open University, also led to formalizing academic degree and certificate programs on property valuation. And I think this is a good link. This is a good link to the industry requirement for more professional property valuers. Now, I mentioned earlier about legislation.
Nino, sorry, you just have a minute left. If
okay,
just a warning.
okay,
Yeah.
I'm wrapping up. So we have passed laws that support the reform program, and currently we are pursuing another major legislation for the Real Property Valuation and Assessment Reform Act, in which most of the learnings and lessons that we have from the previous reforms will be legislated and fully institutionalized. Now, going back to the main question and for recommendation, I'd like to underscore the importance of phasing and sustaining the reform program in terms of design, and that we closely monitor the progress and of course, test the theory of change and introduce the enhancements along the process. And for the Philippines, the next step is to continue the reform momentum, because reforms don't get accomplished overnight. We must mainstream the reforms, and advocacy is vital in this regard. And partnerships and collaboration with the different stakeholders is necessary as we wish to establish an efficient, equitable, transparent, and reliable property tax administration system in our country. Thank you, Damian.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would directly then direct a question to Sarah. And maybe this is the report you have mentioned, the Tax Policy Reforms 2020 report. It is underlined that the main property tax reforms in 2021 aimed at increasing progressivity and fairness. And my question would be, what have been the main elements of the reforms to achieve these goals? And what would be the most important guiding principles to make reform happen and accelerate?
Yes. So you are mentioning a report that I used to lead. I don't lead it anymore, but it's still a very good report. So it's a report that looks at tax reforms every year. And so in 2022, there were a number of reforms that were reported when it comes to property taxes, and always with this notion of enhancing fairness, which is, I guess, understandable in a post-pandemic context. So if you're interested in the various reforms, you can have a look at the report, but the main one was the reform in Ireland with their local property tax. So the reform did two things. The first one was to update the fiscal cadaster, which previously included values from 2013. And then the second element of that reform was to bring new properties in the tax base, so mainly properties that had been built since 2013. That was the big element of the reform, but at the same time, what Ireland did, a bit like Denmark and other countries that have done these value updates, is to reduce property tax rates at the same time to make sure that property tax liabilities remain the same for a majority of households. So I think that was the main reform last year, and this is in line with what I mentioned in my first intervention, which is probably the biggest priority when it comes to property tax reform in many OECD countries is to make sure that they're based on regularly updated market values. So it's interesting that the biggest reform actually went in that direction. Another very important message, and this I'm very interested in what you were talking about in the example of Freetown, because I think the notion that there are general recommendations doesn't work. I just gave you one for OECD countries. Make sure your property tax is based on regularly updated market values. Makes sense in an OECD context. I'm not sure it makes that much sense for an emerging or developing country context, and this is what you said. You probably have to go for a simpler mechanism, and you highlighted another possibility if you're a developing or emerging country, instead of trying to mirror as much as possible market values, is to have an area-based property tax system where it's based on the size of the property, but at the same time, you have some adjustment factor for where the property is located, because we know that location is a key driver of the value of properties. So again, it really depends on the country. I think for developing countries as well, not my area of expertise, really, I focus more on OECD countries, but it seems that a key priority is the expansion of the tax-based coverage. It seems like a lot of properties are owned informally or not registered in fiscal cadasters. So it's not just about accurately valuing the properties that are currently covered in the tax base, but probably about expanding tax base coverage. Another key message, and I think that's applicable regardless of whether you're talking about an OECD, an emerging, or a developing countries, is the importance of governance and arrangements across different levels of government. So the OECD and the IMF and other experts and international organizations have been pushing for years, saying, there should be a tax mix shift from distortive taxes like stamp duties and like labor taxes towards property taxes. It sounds great, but it is a difficult thing because you're talking about shifting the mix from taxes that are primarily governed by the central government to taxes that are in large part governed by sub-central governments. And so it's actually quite hard to operate these types of shifts. And the reality is that many sub-central governments will be reluctant to do that for a number of reasons. Because higher property taxes might mean lower intergovernmental transfers. It might be more difficult because sub-central levels of government are much closer to their taxpayers. There might be concerns about tax competition. And so if we want those shifts to be effective, there needs to be some degree of coordination. And coordination can be making sure that we all use the same tax-based rules, the same valuation systems, and the central government could, for instance, have rules on minimum and maximum tax rates. I say this because there are a number of OECD countries where that is not at all the case. And then maybe a final point we're getting sort of more and more high level in terms of guiding principles, but a tax is always a means to an end. There needs to be, if the idea is to make greater use of property taxes, there should be at the same time an increase in the quality of public services. There are quite a few studies that show that people are much more willing to pay higher property taxes if they know why they pay higher property taxes. And the advantage of a property tax is that you can actually say, well, the property tax is being used to finance this and that. If you take the income tax, you can't really say, I mean, it's much more difficult for central governments to say we've used revenues from the income tax to finance this or that. So the advantage of a property tax is that you can actually do that.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for pointing out the advantages and how difficult it is. Coming down from the guiding general high-level guiding principles to Dario, to more country-specific, perhaps guiding principles. Based on your experience in Croatia over the past 20 years, what are your main 2 or 3 main recommendations to reform property taxation and make these reforms happen?
Yeah. I would agree with much of what was said over past couple minutes. Croatia does not have a property tax per se. We have a quasi property tax, which is called communal fee, that basically charges property owners per square feet of the apartment based on the location of the property within municipality. So we tried in 2012 to legislate the property tax, and we had another attempt in 2016, which was successful. The parliament passed the legislation, but decided to scrape it in 2017 prior to its application in 2018. It so happened that there was a public outcry mid-2017 against the property tax, which was supposed to be a local government revenue. And mid-2017, we have had local elections. So one of my recommendations would be don't legislate local taxes in advance of local elections. There will be no one to stand up for it. On a more serious note, we have seen our attempt went in the direction that we would like to merge the quasi-property tax with other local small taxes which are related to the property into a single unified tax to avoid the inefficiencies that we have when collecting like touristically zoned properties. It's really peanuts money and it costs a lot to collect, so it's really questionable what the effect of it is. Maybe we should simply just drop it or incorporate it into the property tax. That's what we did in 2016. We've incorporated several of them to try to avoid regressive effect. We have introduced the zoning of the property so that the top location in the touristic city would pay more than some suburbia. We have added the control factor for the year of construction. So like really old properties would pay less, and if their condition was ruined, then they would again be corrected to pay for less. In order to have like new properties like villas with swimming pools or helipads to bear more of a property tax. Obviously, Croatia, like all of Europe, we have a lot of historical buildings and we have a lot of historical villas. So there was this question that we didn't really figure out with renewed villas that were constructed a long time ago. So when you correct it for the age, you really remove the tax pressure on it. And two little things that can be done to improve the property taxation that we have seen from these two attempts. In 2016, we have been facilitating for a transfer of central government records on properties and central government records on taxpayers, and basically gave all of the central government information down to local governments to update their registers prior to introduction of the property tax. And what we've seen in years to come is that there was an immediate jump in collection of 20% without even changing the tax rates. Also, there was a process put in place that gave local governments information on any property transactions, and we see another 5% increase. So it's really a simple thing to do, just establish the intergovernmental link, and there is a huge increase in collection without even touching the rates.
Thank you, Dario. And unfortunately, we're actually running out of time here. So I will directly move to another panelist, to you, Graham, and to give us a little bit of insight from the Zambian context, because I know that you have completed a diagnostic assessment of the property tax system in Zambia. Can you just briefly explain the main reform recommendations coming out of that assessment and how you would expect them to improve property tax collection?
Absolutely. So in Logri's research, we see a lot of common challenges across countries, but also some important differences, both in the technical details of property tax systems and the legislation surrounding them, as well as the broader political economy that makes certain types of reform more or less feasible. So with that in mind, our approach typically begins with a wide overview of the tax system before trying to narrow down and identify really the key constraints that need to be addressed to allow a broader reform agenda to succeed. So that's what we did in Zambia in collaboration with the local GIZ team that's there. And the main constraint that I'd like to highlight here coming out of that diagnostic assessment is the relatively low coverage of valuation rolls in Zambia. So wide coverage of valuation rolls is really essential to effective property taxation, because it's valuation rolls that identify all the properties that will actually receive a tax bill and also distributes the tax burden across the population. So if large numbers of properties are missing from valuation rolls, it obviously limits the amount of revenue that local governments can collect, but just as importantly, it also contributes to broader inequities in the tax system, as only some properties are being asked to contribute to council budgets. And it really undermines taxpayers' broader understanding of property taxation, especially if they're not subject to it. So in other words, if only a subset of properties are actually subject to taxation, it becomes really difficult to imagine how any reform can manage to increase revenue collection in a sustainable way. So in Zambia, one of the key findings from our diagnostic assessment is that the coverage of valuation rolls tends to be quite limited. So in Mansa, which is a provincial capital in the north of the country, where much of our diagnostic assessment focused, our estimates suggest that somewhere in the range of 70 to 90% of buildings within council jurisdiction are not included on the current valuation roll. So this challenge of low coverage seems to be rooted mainly in current legislation that links property taxation to formal property registration, so the process through which people gain tenure for their property. So to be included on a valuation roll in Zambia, your property needs to have at least received a plot number from the Ministry of Lands, which means that you've moved part way along the process of securing formal tenure for your property. The problem is that securing formal tenure is very expensive and very time-consuming for property owners. And to the extent that they're then subject to taxation, they actually face a negative incentive to formally register their properties. So because of these challenges, formal tenure tends to be quite limited in Zambia, and a large share of properties are missing from valuation rolls. So our recommendation in this case is to take a taxation-led approach to the construction of valuation rolls. So what we mean by that is that property taxation should essentially be delinked from the requirement for formal tenure, so that local governments can simply add all properties within their jurisdiction onto valuation rolls, regardless of their tenure status. This recommendation is specific to the Zambian context, but we also think it has some level of broader applicability or generalizability, especially to other lower income countries. It's not uncommon for property taxation to require that owners have first secured formal tenure for their property before they can be taxed. So in making the case for this kind of taxation-led approach that we're recommending, it's important to note that this approach can provide the basis for future titling and planning efforts. Building a valuation role, for example, involves locating each property by address and ideally by geocoordinate or perhaps by photograph, as well as gathering information on building characteristics and the size of the property. All of this information can then be used to help expand and expedite future titling efforts. So what we're really recommending here is reversing the priority given to land titling and property taxation efforts. So instead of the common approach of first titling all properties and assuming that property taxation will then follow, we should instead focus on taxing all properties that actually exist on the ground, regardless of their tenure status, which will then help with efforts to expand titling efforts and tenure in the future. So to quickly sum up, one of our main recommendations coming out of the diagnostic assessment in Zambia is the importance of tweaking existing legislation and processes to make it much easier for local governments to add all properties within their jurisdiction onto the valuation roll.
Thank you, Graham. And the last question to you, Huáscar. From your perspective, what are your main 2 or 3 main recommendations to reform property taxation and in particular to improve property tax collection? What are the criteria for successful reforms? And could you share also some examples?
Thank you very much. Of course, I agree with the other members of this panel. What are the recommendations? First of all, I think it's important the work that you are doing. One recommendation is that we follow policy recommendations with information, with data. When we're talking with policymakers, for me, it's easier to go there and tell them that OECD countries are collecting 1.1% of GDP from property taxes, and compare with what they are doing. So one of my recommendations is to keep doing this work, collect information, inform policymakers of what we're doing and what are the challenges and what are the opportunities. Here it's important to highlight that what are the benefits of what we're doing. No, that's why when in my first round intervention, I was mentioning the capacity of leveraging new resources from using property taxes. I think it's important to do that. And of course, let the politicians do what they have to do, because they will have to take a decision about how to deal with informality. No, but once that they have the information, they will have to take a decision regarding who will manage this tax. It's going to be a decentralized system. It's going to be decentralized. It's going to be a combination, like the case of Colombia. But they have to take decisions based on information, data. So my first recommendation, and probably the most important, is to keep doing what we're doing, to have this type of discussions and to collect information. The other recommendation that I have is that I have been traveling, like most of you, or probably some of you, around all Latin America and talking with 100 people from different municipalities, and they tell me always, don't forget, what can we do as technicians to improve property taxes? No, this is not only a matter of politicians, this is a matter of the technical solutions. What can we do to improve our taxes? And my recommendation is that we have to think on very practical solutions to help them solve this problem. When we are talking about valuation, here we're talking about assessment. Seems to be that this is a very common problem. We are at IDB. We are in a research project that I'm leading. This research project to provide solutions for Latin American cities of different capabilities. So are we going to use the same methodologies, computer assessment, mass modeling, or regression analysis, or some things that they look very difficult for them? Or are we going to tailor solutions for different types of municipalities? So what we're doing is basically to use data analysis to help them develop models that could fit their own capabilities. We talked about that before. In order to make substantive reform, it's important to calibrate what you are offering as a solution to the local capacities. So we have here a very important possibility. The use of data analysis is really important. That makes a difference of what we were talking about 10 years ago. I read some reports, including some of the OECD, talking about the limitations of that data, that we don't have data. Yes, we have data. No, I would say just the opposite. We have a lot of data. They have data that we can collect from websites, from real estate markets, from different sources. We can build models based on this information. So my approach, what I recommend is to be practical, to provide solutions that are tailored to specific problems, and also have a very direct communication with technicians. That's also what we're doing in applying behavioral economics to local taxation. That's something very important. No? For example, in the case of Argentina, in Mendoza, probably most of you know that city because they also produce a very good wine. No? In the case of Mendoza, we changed how we are billing property taxes. No, they send this very difficult bill with a lot of information. No? So we simplified the bill in one case. In another case, we simplified the bill and included pictures or information of what we were doing with the taxes that were collected in those neighborhoods. The results were amazing. No, people began to pay because they saw that what they were paying was returned to the population with works, with better services. So that's possible to do. We have different studies on the use of behavioral economics, and it's something that provides you with a very simple solution.
Sorry, if you could wrap it up.
I stop here.
Just if you want to finish your last sentence, please
I think my recommendation, okay, don't forget, politicians need a message that's based on data. No? And technicians, they need very practical solutions. That's all.
Thank you. And I want to thank all panelists for their interventions and to receive really an insightful perspectives actually from all around the world. So thanks again. Unfortunately, the time is up. I could only offer one more question if there is from the audience. And then, was there another hand? All right. The microphone will be given to you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much for the very insightful discussion. I'm from the Secretariat of the Addis Tax Initiative, which is a global partnership that is based on a discussion on issues in the topic of tax and development, and it's also very based and focused on knowledge sharing on these topics, and one of the topics that is being discussed now is precisely property taxation. But for us, one of the challenges that we see is how we link revenues from property taxation with expenditure. So how we build this relationship with citizens, how we can explain to them, okay, we are having this property taxation, or we have this reform, but we will you will receive this as a way to say, okay, you are paying, but you are receiving something else. And what's this something else? It's public services of quality. So that's something I think it will be really nice to hear from you if there are some good examples of cities that have implemented some strategies to build this relationship. I know there is from Freetown, like something that they did, like a very interesting, but it was like in a minor scale, so I would like to hear more about that.
Yeah, I was going to respond. Thank you for that question. I mean, I think as we've heard from a few panelists, this link between property taxation or revenue and services is really essential, because that's what builds the confidence and trust that actually allows for increasing more revenue collection and then delivering more services. So part of a component of the reform in Freetown was a participatory budgeting pilot, essentially. So it was originally meant to be in-person town hall meetings through which groups of residents would vote on specific service delivery projects in their wards. It got started right when COVID kicked off, so it ended up becoming a digital town hall project where people were basically added to WhatsApp groups for their wards or for their neighborhoods. But yeah, so that was the idea, is that they voted on specific projects that to allocate revenue to their neighborhoods, and that came along with a promise from the mayor that in the future 20% of all property tax revenue collected in each ward would be allocated through this kind of participatory budgeting process. And the kind of simplified assessment that I described before really allows for knowing how much revenue has been raised in the different wards, so that you can actually do that type of allocation. So the research on that is still, it hasn't been published yet, but I think the general results are that participation in the town halls, it increased compliance for some people, not for everyone, but broadly it improved perceptions of, it made perceptions of the reform and of city council more positive. Yeah.
Very good question. You have different experiences that are very important. No? I would say that one of the most important one is the U.S. No, in the U.S., you pay property taxes, and local governments use your property taxes to finance your school. So, and the level of compliance is, of course, very, very high. So if you want to think about, a very important experience, I would say that making reference to the U.S. is, a must. No, in developing countries, different experiences. Very important. If you want, we can exchange later some information. I made a reference to Mendoza, where they have this collection. Also, the case of La Pampa in Argentina. Too, they made a lottery, for people who were paying taxes, So they were offering something to the neighborhood, so they could benefit from the fact that they were paying taxes on time. So you have different schemes, different models, different possibilities to incentivize people to pay taxes when you relate them with some benefits.
In Croatia, we have also been using the participatory budgeting as a vehicle to bring together citizens and politicians and explain the property tax revenues and let them set the priorities by voting for whatever actions. The other vehicle we're using are so-called budgeting brief, the small booklets which pretty much show how much revenues were collected and where they've been spent, with photos, illustrations, really meant for citizens, not for people from departments of finance. On a technical level, if that was maybe the part of your interest, in our database systems we have records of collection of property tax based on the individual address level. So you can aggregate it to the municipal, to neighborhood council levels or small districts or whatever, and then run the search on investments by location to these areas. So that's also one way you can really show what has been done with taxpayers' money.
I don't have a specific example to give you, but in the report we cite a new study from Jacobasso and others that shows the impact of telling taxpayers what the money is used for. And so that's also, it came out this year, very interesting.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to close this roundtable now. I think my only obligation would be now to refer to the coffee break and that we will meet in the room at 4:30 sharp. And we would like to say goodbye to... no, I see him. Nino, goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so 4:30, please. Be back.
Bye. Thank you.